I'm Corbett Wall with DV Auction, here with your feeder flash for Monday, April the 1st, and thank goodness we're into a new month. A lot of people in the cattle business are glad to see March out of the way. We are in a bear market on your fat cattle trade now, and going to be for the foreseeable future after that big flop of a Wednesday morning trade that we had last week. It's really got things, moods down as far as on your fed cattle arena. But we will see your feeder cattle prices gain ground, and we saw a lot of really high prices on some stocker cattle and calves as we're getting geared up for that. Going to be a ton of grazing, and that is where guys can kind of make up some ground that they've lost, is on that cheap gain that you can get turning those cattle out on grass. But getting into a new month, April here. We had a little more wintry weather up in the Midwest over the weekend, but those little spurts are going to get smaller and smaller, and the warm days and sunshine are going to get longer and longer, and it's time to get a bright outlook for spring. But let's look at the board for last week. April live cattle futures ended the week at 125.70, which was down $4.02 for the week. June ended at 119 even, so that shows you kind of where we're headed. Down $4.50 for the week. Now April feeder cattle ended the week at 145.25, down $3.55. May was at 148.77. Now your March feeder cattle contract went off the board this past week at 141.74. Your fall contracts, like I said, we're going to gain ground on them. Those are the best doing cattle of the year as far as feedlots buying them. And those cattle coming off those pastures, those green yearling cattle, sell well, and those contracts are now up over 158, and that's very significant here over the next several weeks. Is if we can gain some ground on there, there'll be a lot of cattle priced off of those fall feeder cattle contracts at a basis one way or the other. Your fat cattle trade 68,600 head through Thursday, and probably not much significant trade on Friday, so not expecting much over 70,000 for the week last week, which once again is another light week, quite a bit lighter than the same week a year ago, and we've seen that trend more and more all year long. Northern Plains live sales 126 to 127 for the most part, $2 lower. Southern Plains 125 to 126, a full $3 lower on a Wednesday morning trade. And your dress sales 205 to 206 for the most part, and that was $2 lower. And you see that dress price looks a little better than the live price because our dress percentages are really down right now, because you see most of your dress trade up in the Northern Plains, and a lot of those cattle carrying tag, and they're not having a very good dressing percentage. If you look at the weighted average live price in your 5-area feeding region, which is in the 126 range, you can achieve that at 206, your top price on dressed. That's at just over 61% dressing percentage, which is not very good. Normally you would think an average dressing percentage would be around 62.5, but that gives you an idea where that's at. And the Southern Plains guys can't ever get a dress price. Box beef cutout values for last week. The average trade for last week, choice cuts 228.20, down 75 cents compared to the previous week's weighted average. Selects 219.33, up 67 cents. So kind of a mixed week there. And I tell you what, the packers are just as good negotiating in sales of their product. They're just as good at doing that as they are buying the cattle on the front end. And we thought that it was going to drop back off, and they're tug and war, and they're doing a pretty good job of keeping their cutout values pretty high, and they're just really good at what they do. You look at your slaughter for last week, 614,000 was a little disappointing. We were keeping up with the monster week of over 630,000 the prior week, all week until the tail end, and then it dropped off. But that 614,000 was 17,000 less than that big week the week before, but 24,000 more than the same week a year ago, which is good. Your actual slaughter data coming in on Thursday from the week that ended March the 16th. Had your true data there. Average dressed steer weight 865 pounds. That was 6 pounds lighter than the previous week's report and 12 pounds lighter than the same time a year ago. Going to be interesting to see how much that weight drops when we get into the next week or two and towards the end of March, when those cattle were really suffering there in that flood up there. But let's look at some of your feeder cattle markets. Your real-time index on Cattle Market Central ended the week at 139.22. That was $2.38 lower for the week. After your cash feeders in your auction started the week off bright. They started off a little bit higher and looked like they were going to sell pretty good. And Monday and Tuesday sales did pretty well. But on your cattle going right into the feedlot, your feeder weights, after that Wednesday morning flop of a trade, it just put everybody in sour moods, and then and all went south and lost everything we gained as far as on a trend. And like I said, your cash feeders and your sales ended the week steady to 3 lower. But your calves and stocker cattle, of course, we haven't even hardly seen much green grass yet, but the horizon's just about to turn green, and when it does, people will get grass fever and just go crazy. And they're starting to do it already. We saw some prices this past week that were really out there on the right kind of cattle to turn out, stocker type cattle. And I mentioned before, we see stockers being heavier and heavier all the time, especially in some of those big turnout areas on grass. You see guys turn cattle out, some of them weigh over 700 pounds, and that's because it's not hard to sell a 1,000-pound yearling steer anymore like it might have been several years ago. Be scared to get them that big because they'd be hard to sell, but you can sell them now and get along good. And it's just fun for those guys to put those cheap pounds on turning those cattle out on grass. But firm to $5 higher on your calves and stocker cattle. Look at some of the prices there. Burwell, Nebraska on Friday had a sale, kind of a light run. They had some of that wintry weather. It was snowing and nasty around there, and guys are really sick of it. But a lighter run of under 1,700 head there. But look at some of the prices. 100 head string of 558-pound steers at Burwell brings $206.50. And a little bit further up in the northern plains, Magnus Livestock at Huron, South Dakota sold 60 head of feeder steers weighing 838 at $151.75. That's your feeder flash for Monday.